All right. Well, good afternoon, everyone. My name is Stacy, and I handle adult education here at the North Carolina Museum of History. And we're so glad that you're joining us for today's program, History at High Noon, Native America, the Great War, the American Revolution. We ask that you please type your questions for our guest speaker into the chat function located at the bottom center of your screen. At the end of our lecture, our adult programs intern will ask our speaker as many of your questions as time allows. It's my honor to introduce and welcome back Jamie K. Oxendine, author, educator, historian, speaker, and member of the Lumbee Tribe of North Carolina. Jamie is a Native American author, educator, historian, speaker, and member of the Lumbee Tribe. He is the author of Southeastern Woodland Designs 2018, as well as author and editor at powwows.com. Jamie has been an adjunct professor of Native American Studies at Bowling Green State University, Ohio State University, the University of Toledo, and Lourdes University. Did I say that right, Jamie?
Close,
Um,
Lords.
Lourdes. Okay, got it. Thank you. He also worked as the Native American liaison and education consultant for Ohio University. So, Jamie, the floor is yours. Welcome. Thanks for being with us today.
Thank you very much, Stacy, and welcome everyone. So we're going to talk about Native America in the American Revolution, and I'll take my camera off so I won't be distracting. So you see that beautiful picture. It's a picture of one of the many rivers in the East Coast, and the British are in their bright red coats, and they are going to a camp where they are allied with the Native Americans. Next slide, please. So the American Revolution was a new conflict to the native peoples, and they were very confused because to them it was yet another conflict, another war about the same three things that the Europeans were arguing over, quarreling over, which was land trade and slaves. When I say the word slaves, we're not talking about African slaves. We're talking about natives that were used as slaves, specifically women and children that were captured by the colonists and sold into slavery. Now, when we got past the French and Indian War, finally, the natives, most of them, became to trust the British Crown because the British Crown made a promise that no colonists could go across the new 1763 Declaration Line, which is basically the Appalachian Mountains. Many natives saw this conflict as a family thing. They looked at the British as the parents and they looked at the Americans as the children. Next slide, please. Now, this wasn't new. The natives were tired of war. These are the main conflicts that were taking place in what was known as the New World, but there were others. So you can imagine if you were even just part of one or two of these, some tribes were included into three or four of these. By the time this French Indian War came up, it was deja vu. It was the same thing over and over. And they saw these white Europeans, some spoke different languages, some spoke the same languages, quarreling about three things: the land, which the natives saw them as constantly encroaching on their land, the issues with trade, and of course, slavery. Next slide, please. Now, you can't talk about the American Revolution without doing a little bit about the French and Indian War. You may find this whenever you study just about any war, that the war before it is one of the main causes for the next war. So the French and Indian War is considered to be 1754 to 1763. It's given a lot of different names. In Europe, it was often called the Seven Years' War, and it was a true world war. It involved England and Prussia allied against France and Austria. There was some backing help from Russia, what we now Saxony, which is now called Germany, Spain. There were battles and engagements on the Indian subcontinent, in the Philippines, and Portugal. So when you say the First World War, you might want to remind people that the French and Indian War was the truly First World War. Plus, it involved many Native American nations who were sovereign nations. And the war increased the tension between some of the nations and made tension within the nations. Next slide, please. And the war has many different names. We are always biased in US history. We think that whatever we call something, that's how it is, but that's not the case. It was called the French and Indian War by the British and later the United States. In English speaking Canada, they called it the Seven Years' War. For Quebec and the people that spoke French, they called it the Conquest War because they saw it as the earliest beginnings of maybe Canada getting its own kind of freedom. In India, it had the name, the Third Carnatic War. It was the Pomeranian War in Sweden and Prussia, where they were fighting. And it was the Third Silesian War in Austria and Prussia. Over the past 20 years, however, we began to start calling it a new name. We call it the French and Indian War, the war that made America. Next slide, please. So after the French and Indian War, this is what we now call North America looked like. Now you notice the pink is the American colonies. They're the British colonies in the Americas, was the correct term for it. And if you look closely, you notice that you don't see actual state lines. One of the problems with teaching history is a lot of books and pictures show the states now, the way they look now, and they say, oh, this is how they looked in 1763. They looked absolutely nothing like that. And the British made a line, right, as you see there. Basically, the beginning of the Appalachian Mountains, they told the American colonists, do not cross this line, do not encroach on the native territory and the native people past that. And the American colonists, this was one of the first things that made them upset. It wasn't the Stamp Act, it wasn't the Tea Act, it was this law that British had said, do not cross this line. And colonists, of course, did not listen to them. Here in what we call now North Carolina, one of the colonists that didn't listen was Daniel Boone, and he did many trips where he took people past this line, across what was then Charlotte, on into Kings Mountain, and into the Appalachians, across into what was then called Kentucky or the Cumberland Gap. And colonists were just pouring across this line. So this obviously was the first thing that really upset the native people. Next slide, please. Now, what was the native involvement? You're going to speak to a lot of other people, historians, and they're going to give you a lot of different things. One of my colleagues will tell you that most of the tribes on the east allied with the British, and the tribes in the west allied with the Americans. Another of my colleagues will reverse that and say, no, most of the East Coast tribes allied with the Americans and vice versa. When it really comes down to the study, most of the native nations did ally with the British Empire because of that promise that they were not allowed to pour across the 1763 line. And this was the case in the Northeast and the Southeast, as well as the West. And when we say West, you have to remember what West is. For instance, let's say you're here in North Carolina. Charlotte, what we call Charlotte now, was extreme west. That would have been the wild, wild west at the time. Many nations were split on who to side with. They tried to stay neutral if they possibly could. Those that couldn't stay neutral and got involved, it created divisions with the tribes and within the tribes. That lasted well into the 19th century and beyond. There are some tribes today that still remember how they were treated by the English or the French or the Americans, and it's a lot of dissension. And some of them still carry that torch, and you can still see that today. Regardless of that, both sides knew that the natives were great scouts and great warriors, and they did their best to convince them to fight for them. Next slide, please. This gives you an idea a little bit better of what North America would have looked like that time. So this kind of semi-dark peach color or rust color, that's the 13 colonies. And notice it doesn't follow the state lines today. What we now call West Virginia was Virginia. And then the treaty line, the 63 line that they were not supposed to cross, goes right there. Remember, this time, France controlled this blue area, and Spain controlled what we now call Florida, as well as the far west states over here. Next slide, please. When you think of the American Revolution starting, most people say, well, it was after 1776 when the 13 colonists declared their independence. There were all kinds of issues long before that. And one of the first skirmishes that is often referred to as the beginning of the American Revolution was the Boston Massacre on March 5th, 1770. And what does this have to do with Native America? Because history got it wrong on who was one of the victims of this particular battle. The gentleman that was a victim of this battle was actually a Native American. His mother was Wampanoag from the Massachusetts tribe. His father was African American. His name was Crispus Attuck, And he's listed most of the time as an African American, but since his mother was Wampanoag and they are a matriarchal society, he was Native American. So we need to correct that history and get history teachers to make it right that the one of the first casualties of what would become the American Revolution was actually a Native American who was Wampanoag descent, and it happened this day in Boston. Next slide, please. Now, what was the view of the native nations from the empire? Great Britain had many of the natives as allies, even referred to them as brothers. They kept an extensive trade with them. You see some of the goods listed there. That's just an idea of some of the goods. And the natives traded with them the many types of furs and food, showed them the earliest form of using tobacco and helped them grow on tobacco, which became a gold cash crop for the British Empire since they didn't find silver and gold. So King George had very good relations with most of his native allies, and he kept that, and they kept that well up into the War of 1812 and beyond. How did the American colonists look at the natives? Well, this is something that most people forget. When we celebrate Independence Day on July 4th, everyone forgets that there's a clause in the Declaration of Independence written by Thomas Jefferson that says the inhabitants of our frontiers, the merciless Indian savages. That is what Jefferson thought of us. That is what Washington thought of us. That's what the Continental Congress thought of us. It's what most of America thought of the Native people. Did the Native Americans know this? Of course they did. Now, they might not know exactly what was in that declaration or they knew of the declaration, but they knew how the colonists felt about them. And there was a great deal of tension on the frontier because of it. Next slide, please. What was George Washington's view of Native peoples? We often think of George Washington as this amazing military commander and magnificent first president, often called the father of America. I want you to read that closely. This is what he thought of the Native Americans, and this is the orders that he gave all of his officers that were on the frontier. Now, remember, the frontier could be just a few miles from the city. We're thinking, think in your mind 1770s. So he told the officers to lay waste all the settlements around, that the country may not be merely overrun but destroyed. Listen to any overture of peace before the total ruin of their settlements is effective. Notice it says destroyed and total ruin. And did the officers do it? Yes, they did. They went out and destroyed countless villages, burned hundreds of homes, killed men, women, and children, and destroyed well over probably 1 million bushels of grain from what is now present day Connecticut and Massachusetts, all the way down to what would have been present day Georgia. One survivor of this scorched earth policy clearly indicates what it looked like. Said there was nothing but bare soil and timber, not a mouthful of any kind of sustenance, not even enough to keep a child one day from perishing from hunger. You can imagine what that policy was. They just went in and set torch to everything. Next slide, please. What were the native nations' view of the empires? I said the natives by this time were extremely tired. They were seeing like this is the eighth time this deja vu was happening. Yet again, these white men that speak different languages or white men that speak the same languages are fighting once again, and they're encroaching on our territory. What are we to do? They tried to stay neutral. One united delegation, if you read that closely, they referred to the King of England as the Great King. They had probably allied with the Great King in many of the other skirmishes and wars that you saw before, but they were going to hopefully try and stay neutral. They weren't going to aid the British and they weren't going to aid the colonists. Then you see Joseph Brant, that's his English name. He gave a statement in 1776. He was a member of the Haudenosaunee, specifically the Mohawk, and he clearly indicated that the king was great and they admired the king, but the king's subjects, which were the American colonists, were very bad and were treated them very bad. And he tried to stay neutral too, but he knew what was going on. Eventually, they didn't stay neutral, and the Mohawk allied with the Crown. Next slide, please. One of the most famous speeches given about all of this, and this is kind of long, so go ahead and start reading it for yourself, Bungahela was Lenape, and when the Lenape had gotten pushed across the Appalachian into what we now call Ohio, Eastern Ohio, he said this in 1781. He warned many of the people that the Americans were not to be trusted and they were doing appalling things. They were murdering their men, women, and children. And he says in that line, yes, even murdering those who at all times had been friendly to them. And he was trying to convince some of the nations in what was then Eastern Ohio, including his own Lenape, that they could not sit by and just let this happen. He did see it as the British being the father and the Americans being the children, and that the British came to him and said, "Hey, help us, discipline our children." And not long after this speech was given, that entire village of the Lenape and several villages in what is now Eastern Ohio were overrun by American militia, and the entire villages were burned to the ground. The men, women, and children were massacred. There was atrocities that were done to the men, women, and children, and that shows you that the Americans were definitely not the nice people we often think of. We often think of patriots, but we forget how the American colonists treated the native people while they were also fighting for independence, and kind of hypocritical. They were saying that all men are created equal. But of course, that wasn't the case. Next slide, please. So you see what happens after the Great Revolution. Did who won? The Americans did win, and they gained a great deal. The British said, "Okay, fine." So the British had to give up their declaration of the 1763 treaty line, and of course, the Americans just poured across. And you see how the states then eventually got their shape and size. What we now call Virginia was all of Virginia, all of West Virginia, and all of what we now call Kentucky. Actually, at the start, what we now call North Carolina included all of North Carolina and Tennessee, went all the way to the Mississippi River border. This blue part, Northwest Ohio, or the Great Northwest Territory, stayed kind of semi-British hands as well as an independent area for the native people. It was thought, hopefully, that it would stay that way, but the colonists kept pouring across the Ohio River and farther and farther west. And by then, the War of 1812 came, and many of the native tribes allied with the British because the British did make a promise. The British said, if we win this War of 1812, what you now call Ohio, Indiana, Michigan, Illinois, and Wisconsin would become a buffer native state or buffer native country between British controlled Canada and what would be the United States. Next slide, please. Let's look at what some of the people actually look like. This is a painting of Joseph Brant during the time when he was actually alive. So we know that this is what he looked like. Notice it's not all leather. Everyone thinks that by then all we had leather was nothing but leather. If you watch a episode of Davy Crockett or Daniel Boone from the 50s and 60s, they put all the natives in leather. Of course, they make all the natives look like they're from the Western Plains. A great deal of European cloth and trade goods, as can be seen. Next slide, please. This is one of the more famous paintings of Joseph Brant. This was done just after 1800. And he has on cloth leggings, probably more likely made of wool. The shirt would be cotton and or linen. And the match coat, that's the blanket around him, would be wool. He would be using a rifle, more than likely not a smoothbore. The natives were very, very smart. They knew how the rifle worked as opposed to the smoothbore, and they would have traded for the rifle. His moccasins would have been leather and a little more traditional, probably decorated with some porcupine quill work, later seed beads from the Europeans. He has his powder horn on one shoulder, a small possibles bag is what it was called. It would have kept his shot and some extra various things like they had flints and et cetera, et cetera. Originally, armbands and trinkets worn in the ears and the nose would have been made of bone, shell, and wood and some metal. When the Europeans arrived, they saw these accoutrements that the tribes are wearing. They said, hey, we can make that for you in silver and copper or brass or whatever you like. And the natives, of course, preferred silver. Next slide, please. And here's what some of the warriors would have looked like in the Northeast. Totally different from what you think of. In fact, you're thinking, well, the gentleman to the left looks extremely modern. He would fit right in today, going into the woods doing some hunting. The hat is straw and it was woven by the native people, and it is bound with a silk ribbon. And he has on center seam moccasins. They're called center seam because there's one seam when you sew them up on top of your foot. Also behind your heel, there's one seam. His leggings or even pants, they did trade for the early pants with the English, would have been more than likely cotton or linen. And his shirt, which usually came down to mid thigh or sometimes the knees, would have also been made of cotton or linen. The gentleman to the left still carries the bow. They use the bow because, as good as the flintlock was, even a very good, quick person could probably only get about 2 or 3 shots off of the flintlock in a minute. Good warrior with the bow could get 6 arrows off to his target in less than a minute. So these are what an artist rendition looks like of the Stockbridge Indians. That's what they were called because of the town in Massachusetts, right around the beginning of the American Revolution. Next slide, please. Here are some more of the native people. You see the word Iroquois there. That's a French word. They call themselves Haudenosaunee. It means people of the Longhouse. And many of the natives, specifically when the weather was warm, they went shirtless and they would have been out on the battlefield like this. A great deal of the natives painted their entire body, a black or a red. It served as war paint to frighten the enemy. It also served as a natural sunscreen. And these two natives shaved their head. The Eastern warriors, especially of the Northeast, were common to shave their entire head except for a scalp lock. The one gentleman to the left is wearing what is called a roach. It's a headdress made of hair. It could be made of porcupine hair and badger hair. Traditionally, it was made of turkey beard hair. Next slide, please. Is a beautiful artist rendition of a warrior of the eastern part of what we now call the United States, using a bow instead of a rifle or a smoothbore from the English or the French. And I have to put in there, they even traded with the Spanish far south. And many times the natives were actually more and better equipped than and better armed than the English and the Americans. You have to remember this was a time of war when two armies stood in a giant field and threw as much lead at each other as possible, and whoever left standing took the field. The natives traded for the rifles, so they were a better shot. And of course, they did guerrilla warfare where they didn't stand out in the middle of a field. They took refuge behind the woods and the trees and various other things like that. Next slide, please. Another beautiful rendition of a native warrior who is wearing a military coat. Contrary to popular belief, they did not take the coats off the dead. It wasn't because they were being respectful for the dead. One of the main reasons is Europeans to the natives were not very clean. They were not very hygienic. And you can study this and find this out. Natives washed as much as possible and bathed as much as possible and washed their hair as much as possible. Your average European and even American colonists, if they were lucky, they took a bath once a week, which is very, very rare. If they were lucky, they took a bath once a month. Water was not considered something that you bathed in. So they would have taken trophies from the battlefield. They would have cut off fingers and cut off ears and of course take scalps. They would have took arms and guns and powder and lead and ball, but very rarely would they have taken military coats. If you saw a warrior in a military coat, there's a 99% chance that that was a gift from the empire. Next slide, please. And here's a picture of me, and I'm wearing a British coat, which would have been a gift from His Majesty the Crown for being allied with the people. My shirt is linen, and my leggings are wool. My moccasins are leather, and they are center seam, and they are decorated with porcupine quill work. And I'm wearing my hat is father up in the time period. So imagine I wouldn't have that on for the American Revolution. So from the neck down, would have been the American Revolution. I'm wearing a Glengarry, which would have been after 1790, because this particular picture is for a living history event for the War of 1812. And they would have also been given the gift of the king's colors. Notice there's something missing in the king's colors. We'll see if you can figure it out. Next slide, please. This particular one, I like to sometimes portray that there were allies to the American colonists, not all allied with the British, there were a few. So in this particular shot, I would have been gifted an American artillery coat. So this is what the American coat looks like. And it's a little different from the previous coat. Can we go back one to the previous slide real quick? On this British coat, the entire coat is wool on the inside. It's lined with linen. The face and color is black. The face and color told you what regiment or what section the military was. And all that yellow is known as military braid. Real military braid had actual real gold, silver threads in it, and it had a metallic like feel. So go back to the next slide, please. The Americans weren't able to do that. So the yellow trimming that you see on this American coat was just plain old cotton. So it gives you an idea that one of the reasons the Americans look so different in the American Revolution is they didn't have any consistency in uniforms. They didn't have any consistency in fabric. In fact, textiles still came from Europe. Next slide, please. One more picture of me here is with the bow. The bow was still used because many warriors could get off their arrows much faster than they could ball and lead. Plus, if it was wet or even if it was very humid, it could be bright and beautiful and sunny, but it was very humid. There are times your powder might not go off. Black powder is hygroscopic. It absorbs moisture out of the air. So my leggings are made of wool, and the garters around the leggings are shell. That's wampum. There's a wampum sash going across my shoulder, which is holding up my quiver. Notice the quiver is down by my waist. It's not high up on my upper back like we mostly think of Robin Hood and Lord of the Rings and everybody else that wore their quiver. The natives wore their quiver much, much low to the waist, even at their hip. It actually accesses the arrows much quicker. Next slide, please. And the natives also traded for canvas. We're thinking that all the natives lived in wigwams and longhouses. They did. But by the American Revolution, a great deal of natives were trading canvas and canvas wedges with the British as well as with the French, even some of the Spanish. So by 1777, you would go into a woodland Indian village, you would see perhaps some longhouses, maybe even see some wigwams, and don't be surprised if you would see some period correct canvas tents like this one. And these people are allied with the British because they're flying the King's colors. Now, I mentioned that earlier, if you knew why they're called the King's colors. So we'll wait till we get to the question and answer part and see if you knew why it's called the King colors. Next slide, please. Here's another camp. This would be several natives, and they would probably would have been camped in a village where they would have had a combination of traditional longhouses and wigwams made of bark and grass mats, but also would have traded with the English, their allies, or the French before in the French and Indian War. And a lot of times the whole camp was a gift. The English had hundreds of warehouses. We're not exactly sure what a warehouse size was. It's definitely not the size of today's warehouse, but probably think the size of maybe an average home, a building about like a two-story barn. And the English had these full of all kinds of trade items and gifts to give to their native allies. And some of those gifts would be the entire camp, the tent, the awning, the ropes and poles to put it together, furniture. And again, you see the King's colors. Next slide, please. And here's a very good picture of the King's colors. So I'm going to ask you for a third time, why is the flag called the King's colors? And if I'm not mistaken, I think that's the last slide. Go one more and see if that was the last slide. Yep, so back up one more to that last slide. So to really study the American Revolution, the natives in the American Revolution would be an entire year-long double semester course because you'd probably have to spend all a semester on just the French and Indian War to see the many causes of how that created the American Revolution. It was in the French and Indian War when the colonists started to really see how their treatment from the British Crown was going to be. And after that, they really noticed that things started to go up. England was in debt from the French and Indian War and all those other wars that you saw before. And they needed to increase taxes. So you had various things like the Stamp Act, the Tea Act, and many other things like that. And the American colonists were upset that they couldn't go across the Appalachian Mountain. And you put all of these things together, and the fact that they were still fighting over the same three things: land, trade, and taking Native people as slaves. It finally erupted and became the American Revolution. The people that truly lost the American Revolution weren't the British Empire. British still had its empire, still controlled what is now Canada, and it would have land in what is now Africa, as far as Australia, India. So the British Empire was really didn't hurt that much by losing 13 colonies. But the people that truly lost were all the natives. And as I said before, this animosity that was created between tribes because some tribes chose the Americans and some tribes chose the British went well into the 19th century and even to the 20th century. So that's all I have. If there are any questions, I'd be happy to answer them. But first, let me see if anybody knows why the particular flag that was a gift to the Native allies is called the King's Colors. And somebody got it right. They said the St. Patrick cross is missing. That is correct because the King's colors was Scotland and England. St. George's cross is the red cross. St. Andrew's cross is the giant X. Later on, St. Patrick's cross was added, and then that was the Union Jack. But that was well after 1800. So very good there. Someone says, did Native Americans ever use camouflage color fatigues today otherwise? No, not really. The natives would paint their entire body, but the paint was to frighten the enemy. You can imagine 400 warriors going up against 1,000 of the military, and that may seem one-sided, but you've got warriors and their dramatic paint. The entire body is painted red or the entire body is painted black, and they are running at you at full tilt and they're screaming, but they're staying far enough away to know that your smoothbore range can't hit them. And you can imagine something like that scaring undisciplined soldiers. And this was very common. A good idea is look at the movie The Patriot. You can see how long it takes standard militia and even regular smoothbore to load and reload. And it was during those times that the natives were able to get off a lot of firepower and shot. When we do a lot of our living history, one of the questions we get from a lot of people is, you've got all this red on, you got this bright blue, you've got these bright colors in your beadwork and various other things like that. Are you sure you can't be seen in the woods? I do several of these reenactments of living history, and a lot of people are very shocked that once we get into the woods, they can't find us. The natives would be very still and they wouldn't move at all. And several of my friends said, I didn't see you until you moved. I said, exactly. You see a bright red cardinal. That cardinal was there for 30 minutes. You finally saw him when it moved. It's kind of like a Bengal tiger. A Bengal tiger is bright orange and black and white, but it's in a jungle of green. And you think, how is that camouflage? But it works.
All right, perfect, Jamie. Thank you so much. I'm going to keep continuing to ask you those questions in the chat box. So if anyone still has any remaining questions, go ahead and type them in there. But I'm going to go ahead and stop screen sharing, and we're just going to come back here together. All right. And so I think you already kind of answered a couple of these questions. Did you answer the one about Native Americans using camouflage or color of fatigues today in other ways?
No, they really didn't. Even well into the War of 1812, they pretty much stayed the same. Even during the Seminole Wars, the Seminoles wore their very unique long shirts, which were bright colors that they traded with the Spanish and the Americans and the English. And when we do one of our events, which is coming up the first weekend in January, we do the Second Seminole War, Battle of Dade, in a small town called Bushnell, and everybody's walking around looking at us in camp, and they're all thinking, "Wow, I'll spot you guys in a minute." And then we go out about an hour before the battle, and we get hidden and stay. And many of the people in the audience said, "I had no idea you were there until you stood up and started firing. I couldn't see any color anywhere." And it's like the blue jay, it's like the cardinal, it's like all the bright birds. Sometimes we don't see them in the, they're surrounded by green, but we don't see them until they move. So what we call camouflage, or how we call camouflage today, really wasn't used upon the natives, especially in the American Revolution. They practiced guerrilla warfare. They did not. They knew that the smoothbore only had maybe 100 yards that it would hit its target. So they did their best to stay out of that 100-yard range. Remember, they were using rifles, so they could pick off the soldiers on the other side, or even the militia. The militia also used rifles, so that was the one time where the natives and the militia were balanced out. But for the most part during the war, the armies used a smoothbore, which is like a shotgun, and you were lucky if you could hit the broadside of a barn at 100 yards.
Yeah. One of our members are watching. They want to know if you can comment just a little bit about the Southern and Western Indians, if you know anything. They're saying that we hear a lot about the Mohawks and all that stuff. So kind of comment on the Cherokees, or if you know anything about that, if you're willing to.
Yes, in the southern part of the theater, the tribes were split. You had some, for instance, earlier on, the Yamasee, the Wateree, the Pee and the Waxhaw allied with the English, whereas before the war, and after the Tuscarora War, the Corey, the Neuse, the Pamlico, and the Weetach allied with the American colonists. Later on, it was vice versa. Sometimes the Yamasee saw themselves now fighting the English colonists. There were times when the Yamasee, that's a river also in South Carolina, the Yuchi, the Pee the Congaree, Catawba, and the Cheraw were back and forth on supporting the English colonists at that time, then the American colonists, and then supporting the English. So here in what we now call North Carolina, you had a combination of both. You had some tribes that definitely thought the American colonists were doing the right thing, and some of the ancestors of what we now call the Coharie and the Saponi allied with the American colonists. A little bit farther west, some of them like the Catawba, the Cheraw, and the Pee and eventually the Cherokee allied with the Crown.
Yeah. And kind of going back to the crown, I know you kind of commented on this, but did any native nations choose alliances based on concerns that their treaties with the British crown would be void if the British lost? And someone's wondering where you can find these archival records and oral histories to these kind of like subjects and stuff.
Picking your alliance was a gamble. There was no guarantee on what could happen. In fact, there were times when it looked like England was not doing so well. And there were times when it looked like, of course, the colonists weren't doing so well, specifically when Washington was at Valley Forge, and which he brought up the concept of that there needed to be a day of prayer and thanksgiving, which is Thanksgiving that we now celebrate. The Thanksgiving we do has nothing to do with the Wampanoag or the Puritans. It was a declaration from Washington to ask for a day of Thanksgiving when it looked like the rebels were going to lose the war. Later on, when he was president, he made it a holiday, and people practiced it off and on. And it was Abraham Lincoln that actually said we needed a day of prayer and thanksgiving, and he picked the fourth Thursday in November, which he solved the records from Washington, because in 1863 it looked like the Confederacy was going to win the Civil War. So I tell all of my Native allies that, remember, we had Native friends, excuse me, we had feast of Thanksgiving hundreds of thousands of years before European contact. So kind of look at this fourth day of Thursday as the celebration declared by Washington and then later Lincoln and then later Roosevelt during the Second World War to give prayers and thanksgiving. So they won't get it confused. And anyway, I'll let everybody know the first Thanksgiving between Europeans and Americans wasn't the Puritans anyway. And what was the other question?
They're wondering how you can find these like
Where can you
archival
find this?
histories. Yeah.
The best way to do this is you can use the internet, but you got to do good old-fashioned old analog research. You got to go to the stacks in the libraries at the university or the public library and find some of the government documents that go back to that time period, because a lot of that stuff, of course, hasn't been digitized, hasn't even been a picture taken of it. And it will be hard to read because just about everything is in cursive at the time period. And the lettering is very, very different. The wording is very different. The spelling might confuse you as well. For instance, the cursive S was also an F and a cursive S at the same time. So that confuses people when they see that. And that's about the best way to do it. So start with the internet, research some of the things, see if you can find various other things that was going on, research all those other wars that came out, and then actually physically go to like the government section in the library and see if you can find reproductions of these particular things. It's like the Declaration of Independence. Most people can't read it today because it is in cursive and it's in cursive of the day.
Yeah. So someone's asking if there was a division within a tribe. They gave an example of the Cherokees fighting for the British and some fighting for the Americans. They want to know if this division was common or was it all or none for an entire tribe?
No, it was common, unfortunately. It created a division between a lot of the tribes, and it would continue on to the next war, which was the War of 1812. And then some of that continued on into the next war, which was the Civil War. And there are some tribes that are, for the longest time, even into the 20th century, was still bitter that some of the nations split. Some of the promises that were made to the tribes, some of the tribes would sign the treaty for that promise, and they were said that the families that signed were now signed without permission. You hear a lot of that about several tribes across Native America from the Revolutionary War to War of 1812 and on, that so and so did not have the right to speak for the whole nation. And so they signed the treaty, which gave away hundreds of thousands of acres. Perfect example is among the Creeks and the Seminoles. They became split a little bit during this war. By the time of War of 1812, they were almost two completely different nations in whether they should support the Americans or support the British. The Cherokee had this problem. The Creeks had this problem. The Haudenosaunee were split there for a while. For the ones that decided, hey, we're going to support the crown, others are going to support the Americans. Something that you still see is some of these tribes still have international treaties with the British crown. And some of these tribes have their own separate passport that is accepted and recognized by international treaty going back to the British crown. And some of these tribes thought, wait a minute, wait a minute, wait a minute. We can use this. A perfect example were the tribes in Virginia that recently got federal recognition. They said, hey, we've had international treaties with the British Crown long before the United States existed. So we can prove that we are who we are, and we can prove that we have been here all the time. And sure enough, that made logical sense. There's a lot of tribes that could still do that, that had treaties with His Majesty before the United States existed, to show now the United States that we were people under the British crown and under British law. So there's no reason why you shouldn't recognize us as a Native American tribe.
Yeah, I really liked how you commented on the conflicts between tribes, but do you think that there was a division within a tribe? Like, for example, like the Cherokee tribe, like half people wanting to go support the crown and the other half wanting to fight against the Americans, or is that more just kind of between tribes and not within one?
No, that happened in the tribes as well.
Okay.
There was some animosity, and some of that animosity led to perhaps a band leaving and going to another tribe or creating. They didn't create a tribe, but over time that band grew and was giving perhaps a different name or a new name, or they settled somewhere else. A lot of the nations during the American Revolutions that tried to stay neutral realized that they needed to move. So they crossed the Appalachians and went into what was then the Ohio Valley, what eventually became Michigan. They settled in the Cumberland Gap of Kentucky and went as far west as the Mississippi River to try and avoid this war that they felt was between a father and his children.
Yeah, awesome. And so, another person's asking if you have any commentary on adventurer, confidence man, and self-proclaimed king of the Cherokees, Sir Alexander Cumming, 1691 through 1775. Do you know what that is?
Yes, I do. And I wouldn't want to be one of the comments on it. I would prefer that to an actual member of the Cherokee Nation, the Eastern Band Cherokee, or the Western Band Cherokee, or the Katua Band. I've studied it, but I think that's best from their perspective to, if you can find get a hold of a member of the Cherokee Nation, and they can give you some insight better to that.
Yeah, perfect. And so this new question kind of revolves around the Lumbee tribe. They're wondering if the Lumbee tribe participated in the Revolutionary War, War of 1812, or the Civil War.
The ancestors of the Lumbee were also split. Some of them supported the British Crown. Most of what was the southern part of the ancestors of the Lumbee, which would have been the Pee Waxhaw, Wateree, Yamasee, Sherrall, and others, actually supported the British Crown. What would have been the northern part of the Lumbee ancestors, the more Iroquois speaking people, would have supported the American colonists. And during the War of 1812, kind of like the same thing. The ancestors of what would have been the southernmost part of the Lumbee people, which some of them were the Creek ancestors. You have Creek blood in the Lumbee because there are several that can tie to the Muskogee people. And definitely in the Civil War. But by the time of the Civil War, the Lumbee tribe and many of the native tribes in what we now call North Carolina were unfortunately badly treated by both the Union, but horribly treated by the Confederacy. A great deal of our ancestors, the Lumbee, were slaves and forced labor. In fact, the Lumbee are one of the forced labor that built Fort Fisher um, on the side of the Atlantic coast. And a brand museum has opened at Fort Fisher, which gives recognition to the fact that the Lumbee were forced labor during the Civil War.
Yeah, so that's awesome. I think those were all the questions that we received. If anyone, we still have a couple more minutes if anyone wants to comment in on any more questions, but if not, I'm going to turn it back over to Stacy. Thanks, guys.
Thank you so much, Allie, and thank you, Jamie, for sharing this incredibly important history with us today. We really appreciate your time.
You are very welcome. And I invite anyone to come to the American Indian Heritage Celebration there at the museum. And that's on November 23rd. So I will be there as well as many people from all the tribes in North Carolina. And you can ask them a great deal of questions as well.
Yes, Jamie's absolutely right. So that is our 29th, if you can believe it, Jamie, annual American Indian Heritage Celebration. It will be in the Plaza in downtown Raleigh. So it's actually going to be at the North Carolina Museum of Natural Sciences this year as our partner for that. It's from 11 a.m. to 4 p.m. So yes, echoing what Jamie said, please come down and visit us. We would love to see you there. The indoor part is a rain or shine event, so we would love to have you come join us. In the meantime, we hope all of you have a wonderful afternoon and we will see you soon. Take care, everybody. Bye.
Yes, everybody have a good day and a great weekend. Take care.
Bye.